Before I begin, I invite you to consider the word flashing presently on the screen. This word, and all that it signifies, has been a contentious issue in the media recently, and particularly since 2001. I invite you to consider what images, thoughts and assumptions travel through your mind when you see that word. What might your family members think, your friends? Thank you for joining me here today. Today I will discuss a very contemporary and hotly debated topic about asylum seekers and racism in the Australian context. I will discuss the violations Australia is committing against its human rights obligations and the nature of asylum seekers' lives on Australian soil. I seek today to educate all present on the realities of this issue and expose how both the government and the media have blatantly lied about unauthorised immigration in our country. I also seek to demonstrate how the media and the government have duly assisted in creating sanctioned racism in the name of nationalism and in the name of security. I will also present a way forward for social workers utilising an anti-racist framework. So thank you for joining me here today and welcome to Unlawful Non-Citizen, Advocating for the Asylum Seeker Amidst Policy-Endorsed Racism, a Moral Duty for Social Work. Before I continue, I must also acknowledge the content of this presentation may cause distress. If anyone feels at any time they need to leave the room, please do so. This year I spent 4 weeks volunteering at all 3 of the Christmas Island Immigration Detention Centres and 2 weeks at the newly reopened Curtin Immigration Detention Centre. These experiences literally changed my life and my outlook on and perception of the world. I'll never forget the feeling of closing a gate in a child's face, literally caging them and walking away and free. I'll never forget seeing people who have so little to give being so generous to each other. I'll never forget that first walk through the enormous gates of the main centre on Christmas Island, the buzz of electric fences in my ear and the weight of a distress alarm in my pocket, and the knowledge that my every breath and movement was being recorded, and consequentially the knowledge that some of those men had lived there for more than 10 months, amongst that. I'll never forget the day I wore an RSPCA logoed t-shirt and one of the officers told me that that was the best shirt to wear because they were all animals anyway. I will never forget the man who signed his artwork with his detainee number and the look of confusion on his face when I asked his name. I'll never forget the man who told me his life story, complete with bombings, gunfire and dead relatives. I will also never forget the look on his face when I took a dictionary into the centre the next day and showed him the word resilient. I will never forget realising just how safe I felt, surrounded by 300 Muslim men in the dark. I will never forget being thanked so profusely for my time and being called a desert rose. Dominelli's anti-racist framework aspires to realise an egalitarian world by relieving misery and oppression in practice. For social workers, eradicating racism involves transforming the profession's theories, practices, routines, legislation, policies and cultures at a societal and institutional level. Anti-racist practice holds that racial inequality bed equals society, and for this inequality to exist, all other forms of oppression have no chance but to flourish as well. Dominelli suggests that if social workers cannot function without racial divisions informing practice, then they are also contributing to racial inequality. To think within racial constructs gives permission to racial divides and exclusionary practices. Dominelli argues that whilst we base interactions, services, practices and theories within the construct of race, we continue to give consent for oppression to exist altogether. Advocacy and no longer accepting the conspiracy of silence surrounding racist practices is just one of many practice imperatives. Advocacy is notably important, for whilst we accept and remain silent about marginalising and excluding practices, and the formations of us and them mentalities, we are contributing to and accepting of the racist idiom. Consequently, anti-racist practice exists in contention to cultural competence, and emerging literature support the notion that to be competent in another's culture or to assume the possibility is unattainable and only fosters oppressive and racist divisions in practice. Racism is a social construct that links individual beliefs and practices to the wider social and institutional norms and practices. In Australia, and politically in regards to asylum seekers, the social and institutional norms are based on national identity and exclusion, with cultural and linguistic diversity embroiled in the politics of fear. Whilst there is moral outrage against extreme expressions of racial prejudice and intolerance, such as the old racism, which was based in terms of biological inferiority, the ordinary, everyday racism of marginalising, excluding the other, is not only allowed to flourish, but is politically sanctioned. This is the insidious nature of the new racism. Additionally, the media present race as an inevitable cause of social division and conflict. If social workers are to exclusively focus on their own individual levels of racism and prejudice, they ignore the important roles played by institutions and cultures in forming and reproducing racist social relations. The rhetoric and language of fear have succeeded in presenting asylum seekers as something to be feared, possible terrorists, an affront to the Australian way of life and value of the fair go, an other that will never be able to integrate into our community. On this slide, there are words that commonly feature in newspaper articles about asylum seekers. These same words are used by our nation's leaders in campaigns in justification for the policies that abuse human rights. Thus, in a well-orchestrated and deliberate undertaking, racism is consequently masqueraded as nationalism. Literature and research have shown that in over 80% of the publications on asylum seekers, negativity, otherness, and correlations to undesirable qualities were a key feature. The People's Inquiry into Detention also revealed that good deeds done by asylum seekers have gone unreported, such as the Baxter detainees that donated several $1,000s to the Tsunami Appeal. There have been instances of blatant and outright lies by the government, and one such example is the Children Overboard affair, which literature suggests ensured John Howard's landslide victory in 2001. Additionally, the exposure of this lie was minimally reported, and thus a substantial number of Australians still believe this is true, evidently exposing the power of the media in constructing, maintaining and altering cultural viewpoints. With media and government as the driving focus on exclusion and creation of dividing lines between races and cultures, racism is being endorsed within the social rhetoric of Australia. John Howard's infamous words of, "We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come," spearheaded the asylum seeker debate and saw the introduction of legislation specifically aimed at restricting and excluding non-citizens on Australian soil. The racist nature of these policies is no more evident than on the fact that on any given day there is approximately 50,000 overstay visas in Australia, with 90% of these people hailing from the UK and the USA. That is 10 times the amount of asylum seekers that have been flooding our country. Minuscule numbers of those people have ever seen the inside of a detention centre for this genuine illegal act. Additionally, literature demonstrates the very different attitudes that the Kosovar asylum seekers received here on Australian soil, with the government commentary at the time providing that they were at least the right colour. Government policy, with the media's abetting, has spawned racist attitudes amongst the Australian social rhetoric in regards to asylum seekers. Policies that are based in fear of invasion, fear of terrorism, fear of security, where people are locked up in remote, unseen locations, produces a self-fulfilling cycle. These people, these others, are associated with inherent criminality. Human rights are sacrificed to nationalism, to security. And all asylum seekers are seen as illegal, criminal, queue jumpers, who may or may not be terrorists, and certainly must be criminals because they are locked up. Consider that first slide of the word Muslim and be truly honest with yourself about what images stirred in your mind. I have connected with the people in those centres. I have learned from them, taught them, laughed and cried with them, held their babies as they slept, and fought tooth and nail for improved rights. And yet these populist images and correlations still swarm in my mind, continuously fed by the media and our leaders. I know they are not true, and yet they are still there. So now that we know the lies, let's take a look at the truth and understand the enormity of the challenge before us. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights asserts that all beings may seek asylum in whatever country they can reach. The methods by which people come, the fact that they have no visa or authorization, whether they paid to be brought here, their country of origin, or the fact that they crossed other territories before applying for asylum in Australia do not disqualify this ratified right. Despite this label of unlawful, it is not illegal to seek asylum in Australia. Government policy is the only illegal here. Since 1992, the Australian government has been systematically abusing human rights by implementing a policy of mandatory detention for all men, women and children who arrive in Australia without invitation or authorisation. Australia's policies have been criticised by human rights bodies both here and overseas. The United Nations is currently commissioning an inquiry into Australia's policies and has labelled them discriminatory, racist, and they have also raised questions about whether they constitute torturous acts. Australia is the only country in the developed world to implement a policy of indefinite mandatory detention to all unlawful non-citizens. Even criminals may apply for bail. Criminals know their sentence term from the outset. Asylum seekers must wait and wait. There are currently 4,888 people in immigration detention centres throughout Australia, located in remote places away from the public. Christmas Island is surrounded by thousands of nautical miles of sea. Curtin is located 1 hour from any community. Leonora, currently home to hundreds of women and children, is located in terrain that experiences 50-degree heat. Unaccompanied minors are currently being housed in run-down hotels in Darwin without access to school, play equipment or even grass. DIAC figures indicate that over 3,000 people have been waiting in these conditions for longer than 6 months. Australia is party to the core human rights treaties. However, Australia is currently breaching its obligations under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Additionally, we are bound by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we are also signatory to the Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees. Many people spend prolonged and arbitrary periods in detention where there is no reasonable or proportionate aim. Most asylum seekers are detained in remote location, restricting access to services and support networks and limiting the transparency of detention arrangements. Asylum seekers who arrive in excised offshore places like Christmas Island are barred from the refugee status determination under the Migration Act. Further, in April 2010, the government suspended processing of refugee claims from Sri Lankan and Afghani asylum seekers in a wholly racially discriminatory move. A disproportionate number of women have had their refugee status refused on the basis that systematic sexual violence is a byproduct of war and not persecution, because Australia chooses to interpret the definition of refugee particularly narrowly. Additionally, Article 5 of the 1951 Convention legislates against refoulement. However, the numbers of those being sent back to their countries and experiencing persecution or even death indicate that this obligation is not being met. With my own eyes, I have seen countless breaches of these sacred human rights and witnessed the human cost of our immigration policies. I have seen human beings with numbered tags around their necks. I have seen